Hello, everyone. It's now 11 o'clock on Tuesday, so we're gonna get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to take their video off on video and join us. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think everyone knows the topic of our discussion today is around how to create truly inclusive businesses, which I'm sure, given that you've all taken an hour out of your Tuesday, you'll agree it's incredibly important and is always a relevant topic, but particularly fitting this month, given that it's Pride Month, and we're really honoured and happy to be part of all of the amazing activity that's going on around the world this month. So, as always with our webinars or fireside chats or discussions, it's gonna last somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, and we'll send through a recording afterwards. Again, as always, we're gonna send through a feedback form later today, and please fill it out. It's so helpful for us, sort of guiding the topics that we host our content and discussions on. But then also points for improvement and areas that we can be better as an organisation. But let's get started. So as I mentioned, we've got three fantastic panelists with us today. So we've got Baljit, who is a diversity and inclusion specialist, and her experience is extensive and spans many companies and industries. I'm sure we'll be hearing about some of the programs that she's been involved in previously. I think everything from designing diverse workforces, inclusive cultures, and of course achieving excellence when it comes to attracting and actually hiring people to come and join the organizations. So Baljit sits on the Midlands Board of Women in Banking and Finance, and is also a member of various other professional groups that provide best practice insights. We've also got Sarah joining us. Sarah's CCO at Bubble and also a TEDx speaker for anyone that wants to Google her. Bubble is an app that connects parents to babysitters and also nannies that their friends already know and trust. So Sarah has joined us on a webinar previously, and I know that she's absolutely passionate about about all of these topics, about inclusion, about diversity, and how things like flexible childcare can really empower, well, in the case of childcare, working parents to feel fulfilled and happy, both in and out of the workplace. And I think sees childcare as one of those often overlooked pieces of the puzzle when it comes to creating an inclusive business. So again, very much looking forward to hearing from Sarah. And then last but by no means least, we've got Armani, who is an inclusion and diversity consultant from Inclusive Employers. And has worked, I believe, in the public and education sector for the last 5 years, and has worked again on a variety of projects, everything from intellectual competence to shaping inclusion. So, look, all three of you, thank you so much for joining us this morning. As I mentioned, it's a Q&A format, so I think it's going to be very interactive and engaging today. I'm here just to facilitate, to ask the questions, and to make sure that if there are any, hopefully points of disagreement, I always find them the most interesting when it comes to a webinar. So if there are any of those, I'll bring them up. But if not, I'll make sure that we're getting the most out of all of our amazing speakers. Just quickly on me and Instant Impact, I'm one of the founders and co-CEOs of Instant Impact, and we're in-house recruitment specialists. So when we work with a client, we embed a team of recruiters with them, become their recruitment function, and we work really closely with HR, and that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations on all of the key topics that surround and inform recruitment. And I think inclusion, diversity, equity, these things are all absolutely front of mind at the minute. Well, listen, that's it from me. Oh, apart from to say, if you've got any questions, there is a Q&A question box. So please pop your questions in there, and we on the panel will see them. But I've come armed with some questions that I'm really curious about. So if you wouldn't mind, let's start there. Armani, I wonder if you could provide us with your overall perspective on what does inclusion really mean to you, and how should we be thinking about that as businesses?
I think that inclusion is so important, especially if we want to get the best out of our teams and the people that work with us. I think that inclusion goes beyond just that tick box term or that buzzword that seems to be used quite a lot recently. It's actually about empowerment. It's about that sense of belonging. We spend most of our time at work, so it should be a place in which we can feel that, we're not only part of that team, but we feel that we can invest ourselves and that we can share those ideas. It's that space, that safe space in which we can truly bring that innovation. So inclusion is so important, as it allows us to really be ourselves at work and also build those stronger relationships. So inclusion for me is that belonging piece, but also to give you that confidence that, this is the right fit for me. I'm in the best place for me, and I can see myself growing with this organization. Everyone wants to be happy at work, and I think especially if we look at what's happened in the last year with COVID and working from home, inclusion has become even more important, because actually our day-to-day has been working in different ways. So actually, how are we connected with people? And so inclusion for me is that belonging piece, connected with people, but that empowerment to really feel that you are part of something. And I think that's why I think inclusion is so relevant in the space that we're working in.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, I think I'm going to come to you next, because I think Armani mentioned a couple of keywords that I associate with you and with Bubble as well. I think belonging was a really important one. I wonder whether you'd add anything to that, and then also whether you think that how the last 18 months of I think for your audience, but maybe particularly pandemic, have shaped that discourse.
I think it's a relevant kind of point for everyone. That sort of the word belonging is one I absolutely love, Armani. I think it was great to focus on that. And I think, God, what a fascinating experiment in belonging we've all been through, when we've all been, mostly based in homes, a lot of us alone, or alone with our families, or from flatmates. How to get a sense of belonging in the last 18 months, has been a really fascinating experiment, I think. And one thing that I think is really interesting, and I kind of try and draw positives from this as well, is that whilst we have, been apart, we managed to, use, video calls like this to connect and actually seen into people's lives a little bit more. And actually, I think that has, in some ways, gives us a positive start to belonging. And so, there's a lot of negatives we can talk about as well. And there's some kind of depressing statistics I know we've all got over the, which have been made a lot worse over the last 18 months. But one interesting point is, I've seen into the homes of all the people I work with. I now know their kids. I've seen them on the video, and I think that's a real positive aspect around the last, the way we've been working. And that can actually help foster belonging. Now, there are loads, I've picked on a kind of real positive to kind of start on, because in lots of ways, last 18 months has made people feel very isolated, very lonely, and has been incredibly difficult. And particularly, some sort of had sort of a lack of belonging was fostered upon them. I know that one thing that I've been very conscious of, and talking to kind of working parent groups, is people having to mute themselves on calls, which seems like a small thing, but if you work in a house with loads of noisy kids downstairs, as I do, you have to be on mute most of the times. If you can't bring yourself to, if you're physically muting yourself, that's almost the opposite to that kind of confidence and belonging that you talked about, Armani. So it's, I think so much of this conversation is interesting, because there's so much flux at the moment and so much up for grabs. And as I say, looking at the positive of that, it means that businesses now have such an important job, because things are more up in the air than they have ever been. And it's really up to businesses now and leaders to take control and think about what they're building now, what benefits they want to put in place, what policies, what culture, all these things are now in flux. So I think, we can talk about now as being a really interesting and important time for business leaders.
That's really interesting, Sarah. I think I sort of decided, I think I might play the role of bringing in the, this is not what I believe, but I feel like I might bring in the sort of old across the business perspective into some of these things, and ask the questions that maybe I wouldn't based on what I believe. But Sarah, why is it why are these questions around loneliness and belonging and benefits, why is that business's problem?
Well, I mean, it's so important that we have happy, confident employees. I mean, it's just a basic, and I think that, you know, being able to bring your whole self to work, which I think is belonging and inclusion at its best, is what is so important, and enabling people to feel free to be themselves. And I think, again, sort of bringing in the kind of parenting angle, because that's the one I know the best. What I've been really fascinated by is a sort of phenomenon I've noticed amongst women in the last year, where they've been hiding their pregnancies. And this is because you can when you're on a Zoom call. And I think it's really interesting. You know, why do women still feel like they have to, like it's much better for them not to mention they're pregnant? And these kind of invisible pieces of inclusion, because, you know, some inclusion is more visible than other, but certainly this pregnancy point, where normally you'd have to kind of admit that pretty in the first 6 months. A lot of people are leaving it much later to announce it. Sorry, and I just think, if you're not honest and open and feeling confident and a sense of belonging, and you aren't able to be your true self, tell people you're expecting a baby, which is basically the biggest life news that you get, then how are you, really feeling like that sense of belonging at work? How are you feeling? Are you really giving it your all? Are you feeling like this is an employer that really values what you're doing? You don't, because that's a clear barrier to me. Does that answer your question, Felix? I know your tough old question.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, I think, just on a personal note, I've just had a baby who's six weeks old, and
oh my goodness me! You know about life change then?
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, I know about life change. I also know how fraught that period of waiting for a baby is, and how emotionally draining that is. So I completely agree. Baljit, so I have a question for you, which is, I think since the murder of George Floyd back in last year, 13, 14 months ago now, there's been a lot of conversation around diversity. And I think that's what a lot of businesses have been focusing on, the diversity of their workforce, and how they can hire more ethnic minorities, hire more women, hire more people with disabilities. From your perspective, where's the interplay between diversity and inclusion, and what are the risks of chasing diversity without first addressing inclusion?
Okay, so diversity is very important, and we know there's a lot of research out there. We are inundated with research in terms of the benefits around diversity. And we do know that if you have a diverse workforce, then it will enable the organization to relate better to its customer base. We know that it will bring greater innovation, that diversity of perspective, because people will bring in their own lived experiences. All of those business benefits are very clear when we have diversity. But diversity in itself doesn't actually produce those benefits. And sometimes we do get hung up on the diversity aspect and almost think that that actually causes these benefits. And really, if we look into the research in more detail, it's very clear that the benefits come from understanding and leveraging that diversity, as opposed to diversity in itself. So that's quite clear. I think we just get hung up on these McKinsey statistics, that 35% financial productivity, and everybody's quoting that. And that's great if it starts a dialogue, but we really do need to understand the statistics and the research in detail. Otherwise, we will focus our strategies and our initiatives in the wrong way and in the wrong places. So it's important to understand that inclusion is the right metric as opposed to diversity. And I often say I say to organizations I work with, diversity is the wrong metric. So don't focus on diversity. If you focus on the right metric, which is around building those inclusive workplaces, they will automatically lend themselves to producing and generating a diversity for organizations. They will lend themselves to positioning that organization in a way that it is attractive to people of different backgrounds and different identities. So what we need to do is absolutely focus on the inclusive aspect. And we just need to understand that, generally speaking, there is lots of research out there to say that people from those different aspects, different identities and different backgrounds, the very people that organizations are looking to seek, attract and retain in organizations, they are very, very aware. There's a heightened sense of awareness around working for ethical and equitable organizations. So we just need to almost reframe the narrative so we're actually speaking to those individuals, as opposed to talking about the financial benefits, because I actually think that's quite disrespectful, to be quite honest. And that's what I say to organizations: reframe that strategic narrative away from the financial benefits around diversity and inclusion, because I think that's quite disrespectful, in that you're expecting me to add value in monetary ways, as opposed to, you know, problem solving and innovation and avoiding groupthink and all of those kinds of things, which I understand. But when you start talking the monetary benefits and the financial productivity organization, why am I having to add value to your organization in that particular way, when other people that have preceded me and possibly go on to succeed me from different demographic groups aren't being asked to do the same? So there's something in that narrative which is almost a little bit not as appealing to those very groups that you're looking to attract.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned, I would imagine that the attraction of looking at diversity as a primary metric is its measurability. When you're working with your clients, how do you help them to measure their levels of inclusion?
So yes, as you say, diversity is quite straightforward. That's sort of a numbers game, isn't it? We know how many people we've got from which demographic group. That's quite straightforward. In terms of inclusion, there's a number of measures. I think inclusion is a little bit more complicated in that sense. It's not as straightforward, but nevertheless, it absolutely can be measured. Some of it can be measured in some of those tangible ways. So that's when we talk to our employees through surveys, through focus groups, etc., and we understand what employee perceptions of inclusion are within the company. That's very much about how people feel. So that's going back to what Amani and Sarah were talking about, the feel of an organization. So that can absolutely be measured as long as we're asking the right questions and we understand what actions we can actually take from the questions that we're asking, as opposed to questions for the sake of it. So there's some art and science behind, you know, conducting that kind of research. But absolutely, organizations can do other things in terms of, you know, data, for example, is very, very key. So this is sort of qualitative data in terms of the survey aspect, how people feel within the organization, but that quantitative aspect is equally as important. What does our data tell us? Everything that we should do should be evidence-based, should be very much, you know, around the intelligence that we're gathering within the organization. So that data, just in terms of demographics, but also in terms of how our policies are playing out, and understanding if our policies and procedures generate the same set of outcomes time and time again, then perhaps we need to question out those policies and procedures, and perhaps we need to assume that there is some institutional bias that is pervading those policies and procedures. So all of those kinds of statistics are equally good. And there's a number of other things that you can do in terms of, you know, maybe organizations want to set targets. I know there's lots of pros and cons around target setting, but, you know, absolutely they do focus people's minds. But there's the anecdotal stuff as well, which I think sometimes we miss. You know, all of this stuff is the tangible stuff, but there's the anecdotal stuff. You know, how do we capture some of the anecdotal things? So if we're talking about employee voice, people like Sarah and Amani both said, you know, people being able to, you know, be themselves. So I am able to voice my opinion in the organization. Well, is my hand going up? You know, when you ask questions in those staff meetings or wherever, is my hand going up? Am I more willing to actually contribute? Is there more energy? Is there more of that vibe? You know, people are more energetic, because I think a key indicator of inclusive cultures is energizing people. And that energy is evident. Are people smiling more? You know, there's that anecdotal stuff that you can capture as well as that tangible stuff.
That's really interesting, and I think to the always try and be practical. So I guess open to all three of you. What are the sorts of actual projects and initiatives that you think businesses can run that have a marked effect on how included people feel?
I'm happy to step in. Baljeet, can I just say I loved your description of an inclusive organisation being an energised one. That's fantastic, and it's so true. And I just never thought about thinking about it in that way before. And there is an energy that you feel in organisations where people are welcome, people can be themselves, and people feel happy to be there. and confident to be there. So in terms of the way businesses can sort of things that they can do now, I'm sure Baljeet and Amini, who are consultants, have got much more kind of examples of actual types of businesses that do. Mine are, I guess, more narrow, and I'm obviously very interested in the kind of working parent angle and looking at gender discrimination, which has undoubtedly got worse. If you look at most of the surveys, Deloitte have just done a really fascinating survey of women in work, and over 10 countries, I think, 5,000 women, showing that over 50% of women say they feel less included now than ever before, which is a pretty stark and depressing way of looking at things. And a lot of that is to do with, sort of minor things where they felt excluded by the way a meeting's been run, the language that we've used. I know that something we'll probably come on and talk about later. But I suppose where I sit at the moment, and I've said it before, now is a time then that employers can take action, and they've seen their workforce, they know. And again, I'm coming from the sort of parent perspective and the gender discrimination. And we know gender discrimination gets a lot worse when it becomes motherhood versus just women. And the gender pay gap we talk about really could be renamed the motherhood pay gap, because that's really where you see the discrepancies in pay happening. And I think that, putting policies and actually putting, investment where the chatter is really important. And the businesses that we're working with who are actually investing in childcare for their employees, they're seeing unbelievable results, in the sense that people are now like talking about their kids at work, and it's like giving people permission to be like, yeah, actually it's a bit of a nightmare because my kid's sick, but it's okay because I've got a sitting. It becomes okay to have those kind of conversations, and that changes the whole culture, and that brings that energy. I really believe that Baljeet was just talking about. Of a kind of place where people feel positive about themselves, about their work. So for me, I think it has to be policies that are put in place with investment backed by them, as well as all the important cultural stuff. And we could talk, flexible working is something I know that almost all businesses are wrestling with right now. And I don't think we call it flexible anymore. I think we call it hybrid. But I think it's the same. I'm not really sure. And I don't know if I don't think anyone really knows. Is also the honest answer right now, because it's new. We've never done this before. And we need to look at what we're doing in terms of the benefits we're putting in place for our employees. And I really believe childcare has to be one of those benefits that we're investing in, because we've seen over the last 18 months that childcare is what enables your working parents to work. There's no other kind of secret sauce here. Childcare is it. So that is one thing that I really feel it makes a radical change. Obviously, I'm pretty biased sitting in where I am, so I'm sure Baljeet and Amani will have more to add.
Maybe not biased. We'll go with expert, Sarah.
Expert. Thank you.
Amani, and anything to add to that one?
I think actually going back to Baljeet's point earlier around sort of that data aspect. I mean, whenever we talk about, when we look at diversity, I always say that it's like that visual representation of how well you create equal opportunities. So actually, whilst you've got people in the door, how are we actually getting them involved and included? And I think it all starts and stems from that organisational commitment. So what commitment is that organisation making? What is it they want to achieve? So whilst you have that diversity, are you actually listening and hearing, or even creating spaces where your colleagues and your employees can be heard? So I think once you have that commitment, it's about actually getting to know who we have that work for us. Let's create those spaces. Let's have listening circles. Let's have that consultation. Previously with other organisations, what we've done is looking at some of the staff networks that they might have, really formalising them, having terms of reference, finding out if any of them want to, weave into sort of the strategy, if any of them are more interested in that sort of strategic piece, rather than just talking about sharing resources. But I think it all stems from making that commitment as an organisation and that consultation, but the willingness to almost lose labels a little bit, lose titles a little bit, and actually come down to get to know your staff. So last year, especially with everything that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd, many organisations were doing a lot more when it came to fighting racism in the workplace. But actually it comes from that commitment that you're making and what the impact of what it is that you'd like to do. I mean, what's the value behind having you know, all these spaces in which people can come and talk? Are you actually having resources shared with people? Are you diversifying everybody else's experiences? Are you having those places in which people can come and say, this is how I'm feeling, or I think we could do this in the future? Actually tapping into those diverse employees that you have. But we cannot do that until organizations make that commitment and actually stick to that commitment. So it's not just a tick box, because otherwise your employees will feel that they're just there, like Baljit said, because it's financial, it's for, you know, some sort of improvement when it comes to the financial side of things. So really think about that consultation and really asking your staff what it is that they want, how we can improve. And that way we actually have some actions that are beyond just, you know, planning, but we actually have an impact that we're looking to achieve.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, Molly's, before you mute, we've had a question from the audience from Molly, who's asked a question that's, I think you've answered, but I think maybe just ask it anyway, because I think it's a really interesting one. Just asking whether diversity and inclusion are the result of HR initiatives or people team initiatives, or whether to be really successful progress can be made, whether real progress can only be made when the initiatives are company wide. So what do you think to that? I guess, where does the momentum need to come from?
I'll start. So in terms of where does the momentum need to come from, it's really, really important. And I'm sure, you know, all of our listeners will know this. Given all the debate we've had, all the discussion we've had in this area, it's really, really important that this is driven in an organizational-wide perspective. It's driven by the leaders of the organization. We say that time and time again, and it's almost a little bit sort of, you know, even when I say that, it almost sounds a little bit tokenistic. Oh yes, in that we all say that. But it's so fundamental for us to strip everything back and go to that, almost that starting line, and say, have we got our leaders on board? That's not to say you cannot make progress as an organization if it comes, say, from a bottom-up approach or a HR-led approach. Absolutely you can. And I say start wherever you need to start, but as long as people start on this journey, it's more important you're on the journey than not on the journey. Absolutely. But if we want organizations, you know, almost in 10 years' time, not to be having the same discussions time and time again as we have had in the past, then we need to ensure that the way we deal with diversity and inclusion within organizations is done in a way that we are gaining traction and we have a sustainable approach. You can only get those two things if your leaders are bought in. Whatever leaders pay attention to is what I in the organization am going to pay attention to. We know that across any area. So whatever's important to them, whatever their priorities are, is what everybody's going to galvanize towards and pay attention to. So the way that leaders almost message this, role model this, the tone that they set within the organization is absolutely fundamental. This needs to become an organizational value.
I think it's hard work as well. I think Baljit, I think really made the point that it's not just, you know, for organization, for leaders of organizations, it's they have to walk that walk. And I think one example that I've been noticing with the kind of organizations that I work with a bit is parental leave is a really interesting one. So shared parental leave has been around for years, and fathers have not been taking it up. And suddenly, and you know, again, the pandemic may have had some kind of catalyst here. More new dads. Sorry, Felix. Now I feel like I'm picking on you, but it's fair game. More new dads are taking shared parental leave, and that shifts. That is when you see that, when you make that visible, and that is a very visible piece of action, and it's quite a big commitment for a leader of an organisation. And I've spoken to a lot who still feel they can't do that, particularly if it's their business and their startup. And I work with a lot of startups, you know, founder-led organisations where they can't step away. But when they do, oh my goodness, that is powerful. And you see that trickle-down effect, and you see the way that both the women and men in the organisations, ones who are parents or ones who are planning to be parents, because let's not forget, you know, like 74% of millennials are planning on becoming parents in the next few years. So this isn't, you know, when we're talking about kind of parental and gender equality, and inclusion, we're not just talking about working parents, we're talking about the whole organisation of men and women. But when they see that action being taken by their bosses, that is just more powerful than any number of all company meetings or, you know, HR emails. You know, that's where change will happen, when we see it modelled in the people who are leading businesses.
That's really interesting. On this topic of and Sarah, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to go for a consultant's view on this one. But Baljeet, maybe because you mentioned it has to be driven from the leadership. In my experience, and it's only lived experience of having run Instant Impact, but there are only ever 2, maybe 3 things you can be talking about effectively as a leader of the business, so that the message doesn't get confused. What are the key priorities? So obviously, I would imagine a lot of your conversations are, look, inclusion, diversity has to be one of the top things you're talking about. What are the sort of challenges and pushback that you get on that, and how do you help coach your leaders around actually having those conversations as priority?
So I think Sarah's kind of almost touched on this, and you just have there in Felix, when you talked about conversations. But Sarah said this is hard, you know, and I think that's a really, really valid point. This is not straightforward. This is complex. You know, people are complex, and we're dealing with people here ultimately. So this is hard. So this issue around, you know, how do we support our leaders is absolutely fundamental, because sometimes this does come across as a little bit sort of bashing people. This needs to be done, that needs to be done, and this is why things aren't happening, and leaders, you know, are to blame. And it's really important that we take everybody, wherever you sit in the organisation, we take everybody with us on this journey. We can't afford to leave anybody behind. So how we do that and how to get the best buy-in is very much through, Felix, that point that you make in terms of, you know, that coaching aspect, that conversational aspect. This is about working with people, meeting them where they are at. Different people have different understandings. Because I'm a leader in an organisation doesn't mean I know everything. And obviously there will be some areas which, you know, I've never been exposed to, I don't have lived experience of. So how can I possibly relate in the way that other people relate in the organisation? But how can I do that is the question. And that's where you almost work with leaders in terms of having those facilitated dialogue, having that authentic dialogue with our leaders, meeting them where they are at and working with them, coaching them through this process, providing them with the support that they need to get to where we need them to be. Because this isn't anybody's fault. You know, this isn't about fixing people. You know, everybody's got something to bring from their lived experience, something valuable to bring. So it's how we harness all of that. So having those conversations and having those conversations in the right way with our leaders is absolutely key. So, for example, we term this as inclusive leadership sort of dialogue, inclusive leadership workshop. So the work I do with organisations is very much around that mentoring and coaching aspect, as opposed to, you know, that training perspective. And it's really important to understand the difference between those two. And it's the former that is the most effective in terms of having that authentic dialogue. And it's that interrelational aspect. This is a relationship here that we need to nurture. So this isn't, you know, necessarily talking about, you know, oh, this is all about white privilege and this is about white fragility and all of those kinds of things, which are important, and we need to understand what those concepts mean, but we don't want our leaders to get defensive in that process. So how do we keep the barriers down? How do we work with our leaders and coach and mentor and facilitate those discussions? So you know, those are kind of, if you like, the skilled conversations I have with leaders in organizations.
If I could just add to Baljeet's point there, sorry Felix, but absolutely, I think leading with empathy and compassion is also so important. So of course, meeting those leaders where they are, because of course we don't want them to feel like, you know, that, you know, they need fixing, or, you know, making them feel that, you know, that they should know X, Y, and Z, and actually that their behaviour needs to change, but actually meeting them where they are, because I think that we need to make that shift now, you know, where we're having these, we say that things are quite difficult and things are quite hard, and that's absolutely true, but we need to shift from having these what we call quote unquote difficult conversations to becoming courageous conversations, so we can have a positive outcome from it. So by having these courageous conversations around, you know, many different aspects around D&I, we're meeting these leaders where they are, but what we really should be focusing on doing, and what I think will really help in terms of progressing is enabling and helping that leader listen to understand rather than just listening to respond. Once our leaders are there and they're actually present and we meet them where they are, they're able to really understand. And Balji's absolutely right. When you think about the lived experience, everybody has something new to bring to that table. And I think when we think about diversity, beyond just protected characteristics, that diversity of thought, you know, and those different experiences, making them feel comfortable enough and taking that compassion, you know, bringing that compassion and empathy helps them feel empowered rather than making them feel like, right, we need to do this now. I think that that's something that we need to do, you know, quite quickly, but also effectively, so that leader feels that they're on this journey with us. We're not dragging them through this.
Is it important then, if to shift then the perspective of I'm listening to my organization as a leader, I'm listening to my organization to find out if I need to change, or shifting from that mentality to I'm listening to my organization to find out how I should change. And if you're going into those consultations with a question mark as to whether your business is inclusive, then you might feel challenged and you might feel uncomfortable and defensive. But if you've already come to the decision that that every organization can always be more inclusive and you can always make changes that are positive, then it's more likely to be a consultation rather than this is employees, this is leader. So have I missed the point there?
I think that the actual problem is that people are feeling excluded. So the problem is exclusion. So we need to move away from this whole us versus them. It's actually leaders coming together with their employees versus the problem being exclusion, rather than, right, okay, I must go and speak to my employees about everything that's going on because I'm obviously in a leadership position. You're actually bridging that gap so that actually you can get to know a little bit more about what's happening in your organization to tackle the actual issue, which is exclusion, or that feeling that they don't belong, or they can't share, or they don't feel that, you know, they can be, you know, truly themselves at work. That's the issue. I think that if we can see that the benefit for the organization about the benefit for the organization around inclusion will be a benefit for everybody, that way everyone's on this journey together. And of course, inclusion, I would say, and I don't know if other panelists will agree, but inclusion is endless. You know, we are always going to have to keep moving. You know, we're always going, it's an evolving area as well. So, you know, I don't know if there's a set goal, but it's something that you should be continuously thinking about. Okay, how can we be more inclusive? You know, people have different life experiences, and as you're getting more diversity through the door, we have to ensure that we're you know, keeping up to date with that. So I don't think that leaders should be thinking, right, needs to be more inclusive, let's go do that, we're done. But actually, this is a ongoing journey for our organization, because through that consultation, we might start learning about new life experiences and, you know, different ways that people and different perspectives. So we will obviously have to see how we can become even more inclusive in the future.
I think that's really, really well put. There's a quote that I've used in a different setting, but I think it's relevant, which is a Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, so many good quotes, but I feel a bit boring quoting him. But he said, I think it was him anyway. He said that I hire great people so that they can tell me what to do. And I think the point there is, if people are being excluded, then you're not getting. And I'm not talking purely monetary value here, but they're not doing the job that they can do within the organisation. But I've got an eye to time, and I know from feedback that we had in advance of this session that there are some real questions around the importance of language in creating inclusion, or of course accidentally excluding people. And I was wondering whether any of you have any particularly strong opinions on this topic.
Okay, I'll look to start.
Thanks, Balji.
That's okay. So yes, language is really important, and sometimes we do get the backlash that this is all about political correctness, that we're just being pernickety, and really, you know, there are bigger issues at stake here, so we need to kind of, you know, start tackling those. But absolutely, we need to tackle, you know, the more systemic issues. But language, when we talk about developing and nurturing inclusive cultures, I think language is really powerful, and it is really symbolic in terms of creating what we call those in-groups and out-groups. People that feel that they do belong, are part of, and people that don't. So by using, you know, outdated language, or language that is more stale now, or it's irrelevant, it's not up to date, it's not accurate, you know, that almost is hitting my sense of identity, and identity is going to be very important to each and every one of us. So if be it language in terms of, you know, some of the racial language we're using around, say, the acronym, like we'll all be familiar with the discussion that's happening around BAME. You know, the use of pronouns, the way we refer to, you know, the disabled population, disabled people. So all this language and terminology and labels that we attach and acronyms that we use, all of those, in a sense, are problematic, in that different people very much have an individual approach to this. The way I want to describe my identity may be very different to anybody else. And how I describe my identity is my entitlement, how I would like to be identified. So it's understanding that this is very much individualistic from that point of view, but appreciating there will be times where we do need to use acronyms, and we do need to group people together, because from a business point of view that may be necessary, or we're undertaking a positive action initiative, whatever it might be, but there might be time. And really it's then thinking about, you know, what is the best language that we can use, which is most fit for purpose, is the only way that I can describe it. Fit for purpose for that particular, say, initiative, that particular group of people. So in order to understand what is fit for purpose, we need to have done some research in this area, and we also need to have asked the very group of people we are looking to label in whatever shape or form that might be. So that consultation piece, and coming up with the best fit, the most fit for purpose terminology, but understanding that this area is forever evolving. You know, we almost need to keep our ear to the ground and know what's happening as people, you know, lived experience. And Amani, your point about this is never ending, as we become more familiar and more open, and remove some of the stigma around talking about some of these issues, the more our understanding will evolve. So this will be never ending, but it's about how we keep our ear to the ground, and how we ensure that we're continuing to have those discussions as to what's present, current, up-to-date terminology, so we don't inadvertently offend somebody and make them feel excluded of that.
Amani, can I ask if, well, first of all, anything to add there, anything to disagree with?
I completely agree with what Bajit's saying in terms of language. I think language is so important, because I think language needs to be something that you can relate to. Language can make you feel included, or it can, of course, make you feel excluded. I also would argue, especially given my background in HE, that sometimes when we think about the language that's used, and in an education setting especially, you know, the language that you use can sometimes even perpetuate your own stereotypes and your own prejudices. So we must really think about the language that we're using and how it impacts and how it lands with people. You know, we talk a lot about microaggressions. We speak a lot about language that's used, and absolutely, Bajit's point was really valid about, you know, sometimes the data, you know, you do need to group together, for use acronyms and group people together. But at the same time, people do have a right in terms of how they identify. But it's about understanding, you know, what language is, you know, acceptable to use, what language is appropriate to use. And of course, being open enough to that challenge, that if you are using outdated language, that if somebody is to challenge you on that, or say to you that, actually, you know, that's a little bit outdated, we don't use that language anymore, that you're able to actually listen to that. Because the last thing you want is for somebody to say to you, I think that it's important that maybe you don't use language like that, the impact of that could be this, that you don't just say, no, this is the right thing to do. Because had you have said that, you potentially could offend somebody. So when we talk about language, it is one of those key components that can make you feel included or excluded. So I think it's really, really important that we're almost, you know, staying, like Bajit said, keep an eye to the ground in terms of, you know, what the new language is, but being open to that, you know, we might have to shift the way that we speak or adapt, or, you know, maybe get rid of some of that old language that we're using. that's sort of the most important thing that we need to be able to do if we do want to truly be an inclusive business.
Right, and I guess it comes down to those two old, you know, if you think the way to really achieve change is to be humble enough in yourself to accept that you don't know everything and to change, and then empathic enough with those around you to realize that you know what you can do can have a negative or positive effect on those around you. That's fantastic. Well, coming to the end now, I'm just a little bit aware, and I'd just like to have a little conversation around the time in the world, although this will make the recording less valuable for later, but let's talk about where we are in the world right now. Just about to, as Sarah said, go back to the workplace, just about to undergo another massive shift in the way that people are approaching work. And I wonder whether I could ask all three of you one at a time, for we're going through another transition back to the way things were, or not, as the case may be. What would be your guiding light of advice that you'd provide people, HR teams, leaders, businesses as we go through this period? Sarah, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, it's hard to put in a nutshell, but firstly to say, Armani, I love your talk about openness. I think is so important, actually, kind of leading into this. Like, be open, like, just let's not lose the one, you know, one thing I think, as I mentioned earlier, you know, good things would come out of this is this more kind of, our eyes are open. We now realise a little bit more about the lives of the people who are in our organisations, and the difficulties and different challenges that they face that you didn't necessarily know about before. So let's just keep that openness as much as possible, and that ability to see things slightly differently. I think that's really important. And then to me, it comes back to also putting some action in place. And again, my takeaway will be to invest in childcare for your organisation. Actually, to invest in more, and childcare is obviously the thing that I care about an awful lot and think is incredibly powerful, but it's more holistic than that. You know, looking at the kind of healthcare benefits, mental health, you know, all these sorts of things. It's time to put money behind it, though, and there is some incredible stuff out there which really does show, you know, that if you're investing in it, then you really believe in it. Yes, that would be my takeaway. But yeah, to start with, let's make the most of this moment.
Armani?
I think that it's really important that we stay approachable. So, of course, the way that we're working at the moment, it's quite easy to, you know, pick up the phone on Teams or get in contact with people. So being approachable and open, of course, to let, you know, making it easy for people to still contact you. But I also think one of the key things is that the pandemic and working from home, people's circumstances have changed. They've got new life experiences now. So people are going to be very, very different going back into work. So some of their circumstances, maybe prior to the pandemic, they may not have taken on maybe caring responsibilities. And, you know, in now doing so, when they're going to come back to work, it will have had an impact. So just bearing in mind that people are going to be in a different mind frame, they can have different experiences now. Things have definitely changed. So their circumstances may have changed, and just being open and compassionate towards that, because things aren't just going to go back to how they used to be. And that's a really good thing as well, because I think we've learned so much during this period, but not to lose, as much as we say that we weren't connected because we weren't face to face, we have become quite connected in many ways as well. So in that same way, just to make sure that we do remember that this was a very important time in many people's lives, and a very difficult time as well, so that we still approach that with compassion when we're back in the office, or indeed in a hybrid model.
Absolutely. That's, yeah, really interesting. And Bajit, sorry, I always think coming last on one of these open questions is such a hospital pass, so I apologise for that.
No, not a problem. Not a problem. I'm going to build on what Sarah and Armani have said. So absolutely, it's about creating that kind of environment, but it, as well as that individual perspective in terms of listening to people and engaging people, it's just thinking through in terms of that culture and that environment that an organisation is responsible for. How do we ensure that the culture and environment is an enabler to do all the things that we've just spoken about? Because, you know, this is about having those key ingredients in place, those key nuggets. So when we think about you know, we want our people to do all of these things that we've just spoken about. Well, we actually have to invest in our people. We have to raise awareness with our people. You know, that whole point about we don't know what we don't know. People are at different points in their understanding. So how do we invest in that awareness and ensure that consistency of understanding in the organisation, as well as ensuring that people are aware as to what the expectations of them are from an organisational point of view. So that's about bringing your values to life and everybody living and breathing.
Fantastic. Again, I couldn't agree more. Well, all three of you, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed it. I've learned a huge amount. I'm sure everyone has today. So thank you again for joining. Just a quick shout out for our last webinar of the quarter, which is 11 a.m. on Wednesday, the 30th of June. What's next in HR tech? It's going to be a really interesting one. We have a business joining us called the Happiness Index, which is all around, you know, it's just all part of the same conversation, but it's helping people to be happy at work. And I know that inclusion is a big part of that. And we're also joined by an HR tech consultancy called Varan Performance. So that should be an absolutely brilliant one. All of our webinars are recorded on our insights page of instant-impact.com. And there will be many more webinars and pieces of content and fireside chats to come this year. So thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks in particular, Baljeet, Armani, and Sarah, and have a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.